Good morning. Thanks to everybody for joining today. As you mentioned, I'm Ajita Talwalkar-Menon. I'm going to take us through this conversation over the next hour. We look forward also to start off by mentioning that you have the opportunity to submit questions to the panel via Slido, and the ask was to go through the slido.com app, South by Southwest EDU, or through the South by Southwest app. So beyond the tagline for opportunity for all requires a future that's actually mapped with purposeful ideas, better technology, and effective capital. So everyone on this stage lives in that reality in their daily lives and work. And combined, we seek to create new solutions at tackling some of the biggest challenges facing education in the US and for some of us internationally. To kick things off, I'm going to ask the panelists, what is one of the big challenges you're trying to solve, and how does impact investing come into play? Maybe we'll start with Carolina.
Great. Hi, everyone. I work for a fund called Kapor Capital. It's based out in Oakland. We're a seed stage fund, and our thesis is that we want to close gaps of opportunity and access for low-income folks of color. I am a generalist, so I invest in many things, but the problem that I am thinking about right now is what automation is going to do and how it's going to potentially displace a lot of low-skilled labor. So those are things that I'm particularly excited. I think there's a big opportunity around the market for retraining, and there are some cases where AI will actually augment someone's job. So the problems that I'm thinking about really are those that could potentially displace the low-skilled worker.
Hi, I'm Deborah McGriff, and I'm a managing partner with New Schools Venture Fund. We're also an early stage fund, and we invest in three problem areas because they're so closely connected. One, we focus on early childhood through grade 12 education, ed tech tools to support the schools that we invest in, and we're also working on closing the gap between the leaders of the schools and ed tech companies that we serve and the children who are impacted by that work. We are also very focused now on personalized learning in our schools, market segments that will now enable us to personalize learning, expanding the definition of student success beyond academics to include the mindsets and skills that young people will need to be successful, which we call an expanded definition of student success. And again, we don't think that we can solve these problems without bringing to the table a more diverse group of people who can impact those solutions and prepare young people to live the lives that they aspire to live and really be contributing members of society.
Good morning. My name is Luis Pinto. I come from Learn Capital. I'm an operations partner. We are a global venture fund, and we only invest in education in a wide span from pre-K to employability, lifelong learning. I mostly work with emerging markets and helping our portfolio companies connect with local stakeholders, particularly policymakers, and understanding what's the global need in education, from people that still don't have access to education and people that aspire to build a successful life and build a career. So today, one of my focus is really the workforce readiness and how AI is actually bringing this new language into what a career is designed for, and how policymakers can actually make those changes. And this is a race against time where a lot of emerging countries still don't understand that what's at stake is going to affect everybody, because we are on a connected economy, globalized world, and education is a foundation layer that still is not being taken care of in terms of providing that kind of competitiveness. So we will have inequality rising potentially. I'm an optimist, but I know we have a lot of work to do to be able to help people across the world.
At Lumina Foundation, we're similarly concerned and interested in what the future looks like, and we spend our time thinking about the future, but then acting in the present with an eye towards what's to come. And we're particularly focused on a future state where 60% of Americans have a post-secondary degree or credential of value, of working age adults between the ages of 25 and 34. We know that those are the things that are going to, in the future, provide individuals of all backgrounds the necessary knowledge and skills to be competitive in the economy, as well as to be on a trajectory towards greater social and economic mobility. To get there, our vision of a system is a system that is delivering fair results, that is easy to navigate, and that meets the needs that the nation has for talent through a broad range of credentials, not just our traditional four-year degrees. And in that future state, we really believe that it has to be one where attainment gaps don't exist in terms of race or income or age or ethnicity. In 2016, we took a look at the percent of the population that actually had some credential attainment, and what we found was that about 46.9% of working age adults had a post-secondary certificate or degree, pretty far from the 60% attainment goal that we've set for 2025. I should also mention that until recently, there was actually no national effort to look at how to capture credentials in a way that would allow us to understand the credential marketplace, and a credential marketplace and how those credentials translate into actual labor market value. So as a country, we've been behind in understanding intersections between working and learning, which a number of us, I think, will talk about through the course of this hour. And we're missing how these connections are necessary to understand the future of what post-secondary education and training will look like. Sometimes it is, it's talked about a lot of different ways. It's talked about as discontinuous, as lifelong, and happening in more places than just the classroom. And what we think it looks like is where knowledge and skills mastery can be not just demonstrated, but validated to others, especially employers, but that are under the agency and control of the individual learner. A lot of times it feels like we're climbing a steep hill to start to get folks kind of converging around that vision. I actually recently moved to San Francisco. It's been just under a year, so I know from hills, and it is looking steep. But the more challenging thing that we're looking at is the persistent gaps that we think are actually threatening the future of opportunity for all with the racial and economic justice lens. So the degree attainment rates for white Americans is almost 46.4%, but only 30% of African Americans, 24% of Native Americans, and 21.9% of Hispanics have achieved education beyond high school. Responding to that challenge of boosting attainment, of closing equity gaps, is especially fraught in this world that we're experiencing, which, as Carolina and Luis has mentioned, is rapidly changing and transforming industries and just the fundamental ways in which we work and live and learn. As the world is increasingly fueled by that kind of technological advancement, the machine learning, artificial intelligence, efforts to advance post-secondary education need to be thought of more creatively, and that's a key part of what we're hoping to accomplish, and a key part of the challenge that we think will define our success or failure in the future.
Before we go to another question,
Sure.
I'd just like to add on to that. One of the pieces of research that we've been looking at is research from the Institute for the Future, which indicated that 50% of the jobs that children in 2030 must face don't exist today. And kids who are in kindergarten will be facing that when they graduate high school in 2030, and my granddaughter will be entering the workspace. So this is when we talk about the future is closer to us than we want to think about. When McKinsey's research in December also indicated that automation, which was mentioned, will change 40% of the jobs that young people will face in 2030. So, and on our efforts to make sure that Black and brown children and other children see themselves in the mirrors of their school environments and not through windows, we have the goal that 40% of the ed reform movement will be diverse and reflect the diversity of the students in the system by 2020. To make that happen, we we conducted the largest research ever in the school reform space. We'd encourage you to take a look at it. It's called Unrealized Impact. We are encouraging schools and districts and nonprofit organizations and funders in this space to take the survey, and then we funded an organization called Promise 54 to actually work with organizations to transform their organizations into organizations that are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we want to get all of this done soon.
So we've talked a little bit about why the impact investing, but I want to take a step back and level set for folks in the room about the what of impact investing so that we're all on the same page. So the question is, I'll start with Louise, how do you define impact investing and how do you measure your organization's impact?
Thank you. That's a great question. As I said, we're not an impact investor. We're a generic VC fund. But of course, dealing with education, we know we have the responsibility, and all of our portfolio companies have their vision and mission aligned with the impact perspective. And because of that, we decided we're now running our third fund. We started in 2009, and 2 years ago, we started a project internally on creating an impact dashboard for our investors to actually provide them visibility on a regular basis so they don't need to wait for that kind of report that will come every once in a while, but actually provide them a visible layer of what's going on with our portfolio. We have today over 80 companies. Big companies like Coursera, Udemy, General Assembly are very different from Bridge International Academies in Africa. So we had to be creative on the set of metrics that we could have within this kind of dashboard. And for sure, not all companies follow the same pattern within these metrics. So we had to make some selections around the metrics that we could communicate and the number of companies that could participate in each of those pools. But actually, this was an effective mechanism to let people understand that after investing in one of these amazing companies, there's a lot of work that will go beyond their base operation. And we've seen some of the companies that are at the latest stage today also developing their own social responsibility initiatives. So they're adding up beyond their professional execution of business to really create networks with nonprofits and reaching local ecosystems wherever they are present. And this has been really overwhelming because when we started collecting all of these experiences, we went way beyond what was within an investment opportunity. And I think this is the long-term effect that you will have on a new ecosystem that is maturing, which is the EdTech movement, that I believe that maybe we should change this kind of language and just focus on education, because there's going to be, in the next 2 to 3 years, probably a big transformation in this space, and we no longer need to be calling it EdTech to be interesting. I think education is one of the biggest responsibilities in society, and a lot of these pioneers, they were fortunate to start in the moment where they started changing the market conditions, and I think right now we have a platform that is actually worldwide and is advancing quite steadily, and I think that's the hope for the future of the impact of all these organizations. But again, we're not alone. We're just one side of the equation as investors. There's for sure a big ecosystem where we are getting connected and more dependent as we mature, but I think each of us needs to understand its own role and the limitations that we can have in terms of what we do.
That's great, thank you. Deborah, do you want to take next?
Sure. New Schools is a venture philanthropy fund, and we have a fund. We established a fund for about 3 to 4 years, and we're celebrating our 20th anniversary, and over that time, we've invested in more than 500 schools across the country. It is always our expectation that the young people in our schools will outperform other students. And in our latest fund that has only been in operation for 3 years, the young people in our schools outperform the national average. And so we have this thing about, tier 1, year 1, that we don't want to think about it's going to take us forever to have the impact that we want to have. We've started to evaluate already the impact of really developing growth mindsets in young people, and 78% of our young people showed growth in growth mindset in 1 year. Our ed tech companies not only measure reach, as many ed tech companies do, but we measure the extent to which they are also reaching the young people that are a part of the digital divide. And 78% of those companies are also reaching a higher number of high need students than the national average of other ed tech companies. I spoke to you already about our goal of having 40% of the leaders and educators represent the diversity of the student population. Our first goal was 30% because the research indicated that people have a sense of belonging and they're more likely to stay and be retained and contribute if they have a group of people rather than being the only one or a very small percentage of diverse people in an organization. When we did the Unrealized Impact Survey, we were almost at 30% in the ed reform space, so that's why we increased it to 40, and when we get to 40, we will increase it again. Because we're an early stage company, we invest in organizations when they may have an idea at the business planning stage and maybe for a year or two. So we have to quickly support entrepreneurs so that they can become sustainable and grow and receive funding from other organizations. So we like to think that and we know that the investments that we make are then catalyzed 7-10 times over our initial investment, and the largest percentage, and some people don't make it, but most of the organizations that we invest in scale and grow and are sustainable over time. So those are just a few of the outcomes that we look at. But for all of our ventures, student performance is the one that we care most about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I guess I'm up last on that one. Before being a venture capitalist, I was a tech founder and also had the opportunity to work at a tech company that went through exit. So I saw what it means to grow a company from a really early seed stage and then sell it. And I say all that because as a fund, as a VC fund, we don't think that you have to have a trade-off between doing good and making money. I actually think that you can do both. And when I think about impact, our position is that every company has impact. Every company has social impact. Now, you can have a negative impact in society, you can have what I call a neutral, even a hybrid, and you can have a positive impact. So our position is that we want to invest in those companies that have a positive impact. And the way we define it, because we're generalists, education is, I think, one of the sectors that we're most well known for, but we've been investing. We have 112 companies in the portfolio. My boss has been investing since 2009. Prior to that, he was a partner at a Sand Hill Road fund called SL. But companies like Uber and Twilio are in our portfolio. Not in the impact portfolio, but when we were opportunistic. So because every founder, and having been a founder, we kind of like to draw outside of the lines. Our goal is not to be prescriptive on how founders should be measuring their impact. We measure it, but we ask them to kind of provide us what their goals are, and then throughout that time, we'll be working with them to reach those goals. And that is very different across every sector, like something in healthcare, something in food, something in justice. I've been looking at affordable housing investments and education. They all have very different metrics. So you can't have like one specific one. But around education, in some companies, if they're directly serving youth, it's how much have you advanced particular students in terms of their growth year over year. So that could be an interesting statistic to look at. Another thing that's very unique to our fund, we talked a great deal about diversity and inclusion. We believe that you can't retroactively fit diversity and inclusion 20 years after the fact. That has to be within the DNA of the company. So we are the only fund, and we actually started this movement around having a diversity and inclusion pledge, and we called it the Founders Commitment. And part of the Founders Commitment is kind of working with founders for them to set their goals. And one is very specific around diversity and inclusion. What types of technologies are you using to mitigate biases in the hiring process? If you're an education company, do you have folks that attended Title I schools? Are those the people that are building the product, so you actually have that lived experience to build something that is serving the population that you are reaching? But what's really important and makes us unique in the diversity and inclusion piece is that we see that as a competitive business objective, and as a result, when we actually do follow-on investment, it's one of the business criteria that we weigh if we want to decide to continue to invest in the company in the future.
And we thank you at New Schools, because when we took on our DEI initiative in 2015, we walked up the street, they're like 2 blocks from our office.
There you go, we're neighbors.
And we learned a lot from Kapor. And because we believe that unless we model that as a company, we cannot then ask that of the ventures that we invest in. And I want to, with Lumina last year in Grant Makers for Education, I co-chair the Grant Makers for Education Equity Impact Group, and Susan Johnson from Lumina was the co-chair. If you go to that website and look up Case Study 16, you will read about how New Schools Venture Fund implemented their diverse DEI initiative, and how Lumina does it post-secondary. So it gives you sort of the pre-K through secondary overview. I think, and please be in touch with us to share with us your reactions, questions on the case study as well.
I will mention at Lumina, if those of you are familiar with it, it is more of a traditional philanthropy. It is not solely a venture investing organization. But as we reflected a few years ago on where we were with respect to progress on the 2025 goal, came the unsettling reaction that we couldn't just allow the current projections with incremental changes to get us where we needed to go. There was a recognition that we had to engage more unusual suspects in both helping us identify on a granular basis where some of the challenges were, and to seed the solutions that would be responsive to overcoming those challenges. And part of that work involved us starting to do some direct targeted mission-related investing, and that has taken the form of Lumina Impact Ventures. And it's designed to really structure a series of investments that are aligned squarely with Lumina's mission, that also identify promising solutions that improve attainment for traditionally underrepresented groups. And in a way, and with an eye to turning those solutions to what is scalable, what is effective, and what is investable, in advancing, again, Lumina's 2025 goal. As we're thinking about the investments, we're actually looking at what are some of the key gaps that we're finding that are preventing us from getting closer to that 60% attainment goal. And part of the reason we entered the impact investing space and how we define impact investing is really around kind of 5 ideas. And one is, does the company drive a social return that contributes significantly towards increasing educational attainment? Does it deliver a financial return of 0 to 4% for the entire portfolio of social investments? Can it catalyze other investors and capital in support and advancement of Lumina's 2025 goal? And is it a part of building an actual ecosystem that's focused on student success and focused on that goal attainment? And finally, how is the feedback loop from the investments that we are making into the sort of learning return for a lot of our other grant-making activities? Our efforts are beyond just providing capital for the private sector. It's actually really focused on acting as a strategic partner with investees, leveraging Lumina's work throughout the educational, its educational efforts, its thought leadership in post-secondary education, and also, as I mentioned, helping leverage investments from other partners. We evaluate potential investees around that alignment, and we look at the sort of folks who are leading the organizations and how well positioned they are in terms of a track record of success of being able to deliver on, the theory of the early stage company that they're investing in. I wanted to provide a quick illustration of how some of these principles come into play that's actually on the nonprofit side, which is as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about challenges, Lumina has long known that we're not capturing the full market of credentials, and it's a critical part of how we're going to experience the future of work and learning in terms of the fact that folks will get credentialed not as a one-time and done situation, but throughout their life, and that those credentials need to be aligned to what employers are looking for in terms of knowledge and skills. And so as we were thinking about that, we had this first order problem, and the first order problem was who was going to do that part? Who was going to actually establish a registry where we could look comparably across the scope of credentials and be able to speak a common language about what a credential, what constitutes a credential, what constitutes quality, how can value be demonstrated, and that led to an investment in what's called Credential Engine, which is a nonprofit. It's very important that it was not a proprietary held technology platform, but a platform that would provide folks the opportunity to register credentials and, more importantly, to register the underlying conditions of credentials, the actual skills and competencies upon which an ecosystem of credentials could be built. I use that to highlight an example of what we're seeing now, which is additional applications and additional folks with ideas of how to use that data and knowledge to be more creative in the credential space, but to also look at the quality assurance and value of the credentials being created. Do folks have other?
On the credential side, I think there's big movements going on, and when you look at what Google is doing with Google for Jobs and Microsoft with LinkedIn, there's ambitions to create kind of a global standard on credentials that if it's going to be industry-led, we might see some divisive trends there, and it's difficult to understand, but for sure an important topic for a worldwide phenomenon of people trying to get access to alternative education path. And we actually have comments around that already. So,
thank you. Moving us along, maybe some of you in this room have had this question, but a lot of times, especially at Lumina, we get asked why we think this big challenge can actually be solved by organizations that primarily have a profit motive. So I would love whoever wants to kick us off to be responsive to kind of that question. Anyone?
It depends on who's, so for me, I do believe, obviously, based on what I'm investing in, that you can do good and also be a for-profit entity, but I also believe in what is in the heart and soul of that founder, sets the culture, and if they're doing it for the right reasons. I think in my experience, having worked in ed tech, there are a lot of folks that go into education, not necessarily with balancing the best intentions, and that's real talk. Some folks see it as a really big market opportunity, but don't really understand the communities that they're serving. So in many ways, especially if they're selling into Title I schools, there's a trade-off between building certain features because it's more efficient for the company to do than for you to actually do the right thing. So for me, when I think about even entrepreneurs that I'm investing in, I'm trying to kind of follow both, because I feel that in many ways, deploying capital to these folks, I'm a guardian of being able to balance the social good aspect of also making money. So I think there's a clear balance, and a lot of it, especially at early stage, has to do with who's leading the company.
I would agree on the leader of the company is the team that's leading any organization is the number one thing that we look at. We invest in both nonprofit and for-profit companies in our ed tools space and in our talent development space. Many years ago, we made a decision in the school space to only invest in nonprofit schools. Not because for-profit schools could not help us solve the problem, but it was a philosophical decision that we made because of the, the energy that's needed to bring some for-profit school providers to the K-12 space we could make faster progress by only investing in nonprofit entrepreneurs. In the other two spaces, as I said, where we invest ed tools and in people and talent, we will invest in a for-profit company. And once again, you're investing in a person who shares your mission and aspirations for the future of the children that we care most about. And we are not philosophically committed to one form of school governance or one form of business operation is superior to another.
From Lumina's perspective, I think it's important to restate again, like why we are then so focused on effective impact investing, because there is, a recognition that not a single sector can help us meet the challenges of knowledge and skills for the 10.9 million more Americans that will need to have acquired such a credential by 2025. It's not just colleges and universities, it's not just government, it's not just the private sector, but that it does require us to really unleash the power of every tool in the toolbox that we have and to work collaboratively across sectors around content and quality in a way that carries us forward. I think I personally, and I think we share the idea that technology itself is not a silver bullet solution, but we also start to see more and more examples of how it can provide us with a number of those power tools that will build that better educational experience, build that better learning experience in a way that increases the likelihood of a successful outcome for the individual moving through. And I say that not without qualifiers. So, we aren't trying to proliferate a number of new technologies that don't get us closer to the goal. And we need to be sure that more and more we're anchoring investments and thinking about the investments that we have to date around both their business viability and the aim that they have of really improving, using quality technology to deliver education and a different educational experience at a scale. A quick example that I'll highlight is actually a collaboration that Lumina recently announced around one of its portfolio companies, Credly. So Credly is a technology platform for verifying, sharing, and managing digital badges and credentials that allows for mapping of lifelong achievement. And Lumina and that portfolio company just partnered with the American Council on Education, underwritten by a $1.5 million grant from the foundation around an initiative to enable the recognition of that learning and skills development, regardless of where it occurs, using a portable credential format. So it's an effort to be more responsive to the growing employer demand for better evidence and skills, both among job seekers and among the folks who are doing the hiring, kind of two forces that we see both in real time evolving and certainly in the horizon as we look to the future.
I'd like to add to that because New Schools took a slightly different approach to our ed tech work. What we decided was most important was what are the market segments where K-12 education is underserved. And we did substantial research, talking to teachers, talking to researchers and ed tech providers. And to date, over the last 3 years, we focused one of our challenges on middle school math, middle and high school math. These are the places where people said, I don't have a good tool, and I need, because we want to personalize learning in our schools, and teachers will not be able to do that if they don't have the tools that they need. We've also had a challenge that focused on science and the science standards. So many schools were trying to implement the national science standards without tools. Our most recent challenge is focused on the future of work. And we're looking forward to how ed tech companies can help us in that space. But we're trying to enhance market segments and not sort of do a generic ed tech portfolio in this fund.
Can I piggyback on that?
Yes, please.
So I think the key underlying thing that I've been thinking about lately is future. Like I want to underline future. So in my past life, I had I was actually the founding national director for Girls Who Code clubs. I rolled out that expansion for the Girls Who Code clubs, which was an amazing experience. So a lot of folks right now are moving towards, let's get everyone to code. I'm actually like, let's get everyone to think about problem solving, because a lot of what I see, and there's an asymmetry of information of what an investor sees, like we're seeing things that are 5, 10 years ahead, is that a lot of these coding jobs are already being automated. The most important thing that kids, especially if there are a lot of educators in this room, you need to be thinking about problem solving and analytical skills, and the jobs are data scientist jobs, they're product manager jobs, they are AI jobs. Like those are the jobs of the future. So for me, like in terms of a policy thing that I'd love to see, I'd like to see CS just like a math class. I mean, that's the policy world that I want to move down towards, but teaching kids to code is not enough right now. That's just a basic exposure. It goes way beyond that, because kids need to know, and future talent needs to know, what are the right questions to ask.
That's a great point. It's a great segue to the next question, which, sort of, as you look at government regulation, the cultural conditions in states and organizations that are traditionally in the post-secondary space, and you could wave your magic wand to change a key policy, what would you seek to influence and why? I'm going to actually kick that one off, because I probably have, I've had the privilege in my career of sitting in a few different vantage points, and government has been one of those. And it's the reason that I can actually appreciate the kind of catalytic power that government and regulations can actually have in driving educational outcomes. But I can also see the flip side, which is the places where it can step on the neck of new solutions and creative approaches that can hold the greatest odds for driving better educational outcomes. Policies at the state and federal level can create incentives to promote innovation that lead to strong student outcomes, and in effect kind of create those enabling conditions that are this transformation to occur. And I think that's especially true in the traditional college and university structure. But I say that with a recognition about how hard that work is, so how hard it is and how tricky it is to get those incentives right. And the key controlling factor in impact investing and in the way that we can think about what appropriate roles are for government to both protect consumers but also provide space for innovation is to focus on what drives those outcomes. And that has to mean measuring impact in the same way that we think about it. It has to mean establishing minimum standards of quality and allowing for responsible experimentation and evaluation of innovative approaches kind of in exchange for accountability around outcomes that improve the status quo. So there's a way of being flexible that doesn't have to mean being unaccountable. And I'll also make a case that I don't know that folks will believe, but I think is very important. I think absent a clear theory of action that is defined around the outcomes that we're trying to see, greater efficacy and flexibility and looser standards could actually hurt innovative approaches in the long run. And we're seeing this sometimes in the context of things like online education, where there's a conversation that's juxtaposed, online is effective or it's not effective, not what makes tech-enabled learning effective, and how do we iterate towards a more effective version of technology. So not the 1.0 version, but the 3.0 version or further. And it does so by allowing, I think one of the things that I would like to see happen is to see how government can do it in a smarter way than it does now. And some of this is about how I think we as the investment community, both the venture community and the philanthropic community, can take more responsibility for the actions that we're taking and focus our organization's efforts around kind of that future world of opportunity that we're aiming to seed. Do folks have other?
I can pick the policy side. So I work with the OECD and the OAS in Washington on policy for the OECD bloc and also, in this case, the Americas bloc. mostly Latin America, even if Canada and the US are included. The focus is mostly within the Spanish-speaking countries. And, as Carolina was saying, I believe this also depends on the pace of markets. The realities are not the same. The speed of adoption and reform are not the same as well. So while people may be concerned about AI in some geographies, in others, people feel that nothing is changing as rapidly as we can think. And I think that's kind of the danger factor. And I'm fortunate to be in the US and kind of have a global view that probably lets me understand things differently. When you talk one-to-one with those policymakers, realities can be daunting. And for sure, a lot of them are facing local difficulties that some of us already forgot on something that we solved already. And I think that's, on one side, the opportunity of helping them leapfrog and actually build value within their systems. On the policy magic that you could play, I think today education systems are really constrained. And one of the things that I've been seeing working successfully in many, many countries, and recently a big example coming from Asia, is really empowering teachers and connecting schools, creating innovation networks. These are systems that will create an impact that will be sustainable because you empower people, they become responsible, and you have a bottom-up approach, which in nature will be innovative. And this is going on in Finland, which nobody needs to ask why. But I saw an example from an Asian country that decided to revolutionize teacher training by creating an online portal, bringing vendors with education opportunities for teachers to select freely, created a framework where teachers could see where their competencies would lead into promotions, into new careers within education, and they become entrepreneurs within their profession, and they get them money. So they said, here's this money, go to our portal, select whatever you want to learn. Globally, this is going to be positive for the country. And for you individually, here's the motivation. You can get a salary raise. In some cases, it could be 50% a month, which is significant. So one of the other things about this decision is it took decision-making from this idea of people deserving to get a promotion within the Ministry of Education. So there's no power for even other systems that are in play when you leave this decision to this level. So I think globally, we need to respect the diversity and the pace of challenges across countries. We are not solving the same problem everywhere at the same time. Globally, I think that something new that is really accelerating like nothing that I've seen is really this idea of AI on a particular perspective, which is changing career profiles and changing curriculum at the higher education perspective. One example that is very simple, when you think about this language around data science, machine learning, if I was trained as an accountant before this age, I would be taught on manual processes for a lot of things that I would do in my job. Now, I will depend on a lot of automated processes. I will have to be somewhat a data scientist, and I'm going to be focusing on the last mile decision that I have to take. So it changes completely the nature of performing that job, even on personal skills attached to that career. Are policymakers looking at this as a problem that they need to solve, or they had to solve yesterday and they didn't because it's going to take 20 years for people to go through this system? Not really. And you know, in many, many countries, people still see higher education as a social aspiration, which in many countries like the OECD is leading young people to unemployment or underemployment, even if they have more degrees than anybody else in prior generations. So I think there's a lot of challenges, and this is where I believe that we are an ecosystem. We all need to be into this equation trying to find solutions. It's not a silver bullet that will come from a particular industry or a particular set of stakeholders.
No, I can definitely appreciate that. Since I have a magic wand, the other thing that I would will onto policymakers is a recognition about the changing demographics of the learner. And this is one that a lot of folks in the higher education world have been desperately trying to have as a more central part of the conversation and of the dialogue, which is learners, just like focusing on teachers, learners that are adult and working learners are the ecosystem and the consumer base that we need to be acutely focused on, because they're the ones that will both bear a disproportionate burden if we are not creating a flexible education system that allows them to respond to these changing labor market conditions. So people are experiencing these, and people have fears about these in the sort of working age adult population, and that should be where the focus of the reform dialogue is.
So one thing I also wanted to mention is we've been talking about like data scientists, product managers, like very, I guess, more highly skilled jobs, but I think there are a lot of jobs that are kind of coming back, or people may not like this term, but vocational jobs, or jobs that can't be repetitive. So one of my most recent investments was a prefabricated home with smart technology. So think of Legos stacked on top of each other, and sold to affordable housing providers. So the impact behind that is how can we help solve the housing crisis and make it faster and cheaper for people, affordable housing providers, to develop homes. But with that said, when the person in the factory was making the prefab homes, the traditional construction worker had to be leveled up in order to be this fabricator. So you're also seeing that there are going to be kind of new middle skill or middle income type jobs that are being created that don't necessarily require a college degree. And I think that's another important concept. I think when I was growing up as an immigrant, my family from Peru, it's like you just saw, it was very binary. You saw college, but I didn't see that you could do a highly paid vocational opportunity. And I think there's going to be a lot more of that.
Thank you.
Can I just comment on that? This is actually the social aspiration that I was mentioning. You know, if you travel around the world, in many, many places, families still believe that their kid needs to go to college. And that's the aspiration that they never had a chance to get to. And in many places, this will mean unemployment or underemployment again. So a lot of people are really going back and thinking about the vocational opportunities and the kind of jobs that are lying around. And a lot of employers say, we want to hire people, but we don't have people qualified for this type of job. So there's a reskilling also perspective. But you know, one of the biggest challenges I see that we face is bringing parents back to school, in a sense of parents need to understand what's the future for their families, for their kids to build a successful life. And it won't go through the same solutions we've seen in the past. Look at Europe, look at the 80s. It was a generation that had access to college like no other before. And again, these are the ones facing unemployment now. So does it really pay off when you think about the social aspiration that my son can only be an engineer or a doctor instead of just finding something that will fulfill his dreams and have a career? We don't know. So this is currently a big discussion.
I think but the discussion that we have with parents is that your child needs to graduate from high school with a set of skills that will enable them to continuously change as the economy and as the world changes. So I'm a little cautious of offering a single solution to a kid when 5 years from now that job is automated, it doesn't exist anymore. That kid needs to know what to do in order to achieve the things that they want in life, and not sit back and say, oh, I wish we could bring back the 2017s or whenever they enter the workforce, which isn't going to come back. So just this sense of problem solving, being able to be the mindset that you need. I'm going to say a lifelong learner, continuous learner, because that's the kid who's going to be most successful, even if they get vocational training today that gives them an immediate job that allows the family to live above the poverty line. But what happens when that factory or that company packs up and moves? What is that kid capable of learning and doing to sustain his or her own life?
Yeah, you make a great point. It's about having the skills and being able to make the choice. You want to empower the child to be able to make the choice for themselves.
Have the choices, and most of the young people that we're educating in the public school system today are kids who don't have the resources, connections that they need, and how do we enable them to have those things so that they can live a full life?
So one of my friends has a beautiful sentence that he says, honest education systems should ask students what do they want to learn and how do they want to learn. And we're afraid of asking these questions. And they focus on personalized learning. That's why this is important. But again, not only asking those questions and guiding the student into the options that they can actually thrive for, but also connecting that to their reality. So understanding where they are and what are the possibilities for them to build that successful life. But
And I think another comment that's close to that is not asking kids what do they want to be, but asking kids what problem do you want to solve.
I think that's great. I actually think it also applies not just to kids, but to developing that mindset, developing that belief in an adult population, especially an adult population who is at the point in their career where if they have not had any exposure to post-secondary education, had never saw that as a possibility that they can ascend to, as well as even the worst situation, more challenging situation, which is individuals who have had an interaction with the post-secondary system where that has not been a successful outcome for them. And so overcoming kind of that that challenge, that personal challenge that is very much about this broader conversation that we're having about this idea of what do those skills look like? What are future skills that build in resiliency with youth and kids, but also with working adults who will need to acquire more skills to continue to be employable.
One of our investments is works with young people. They start in high school and work with young people in first year and second year of college. And most of the young people are first generation college goers. And it will also require a change in the institutions.
Yes.
Because one of the largest challenge that high schools face is how do you make the appropriate match between the student and whatever post-secondary institution they plan to attend for additional learning. And what these organizations have decided is that we pick organizations who care about the success of young people and who have support services to ensure that they will be successful. And that requires that you have deep knowledge of post-secondary opportunities, and you're not leaving first-generation children who don't have role models in their family to help them make those decisions.
Absolutely right. The navigators in this space are going to be increasingly important, and the ability to have individuals have the right information at the right time to be able to have an actual real choice that is a critical part of solving this going forward. So we have just a few minutes left, and before we sort of turn to close our conversation out, I see that we have a number of questions from the audience. So I'm going to... So this is a great question, actually. So the question is, once an investment commitment is made, how do you manage the tension between tech development and rollout timelines with necessary time to gauge and test within schools?
The leader of our ed tech work not only makes investments in these ed tech companies, but at the same time, the companies have opportunities to have one-on-one coaching. We have a community of practice. They have access to other tech companies that we've invested in the past. Because we're doing market segment research, they have also the ability to reach out to schools in our portfolio that have the need that we've identified, so that there's substantial support throughout the entire process to make sure that the appropriate piloting, learning is taking place so that we have a product that's really useful to school districts.
I think, do other folks want to answer it? Otherwise I'll jump
I'm not
in.
so clear on the question, so that's why I'm not answering it.
So the way that I'm looking at the question is sort of, how do we support investees in terms of ensuring that the tech development as it's being tested for efficacy is managed against sort of the timelines and expectations for returns that we might have. So I would say, I think in the post-secondary space, from Lumina's perspective, there's an ongoing desire to have, within traditional higher education and within the investees that we focus on, a continual feedback loop and understanding of what is working and what is being iterated. So it takes us away from this idea that there should be a bunker that we sit in, a technology that we develop, it deploys everywhere, and then we start to ask questions around efficacy. But that whether it's a reform that's being prototyped or a technology platform that's being prototyped, that there's a real-time process in which we're gaining user understanding and experiences and testing for efficacy. And that's the only way we will get towards greater efficacy.
And I'm happy to answer that question later, because the confusion for me is investment committee. So, an investment commitment. Oh, look at that. I said committee, so I thought it was an investment. Anyway, someone can ask me after the fact.
Yeah, I think we can have a very broad response to a question like that.
Yeah.
And I think times change as well. And I'll focus on this, and I can take it offline later. But I think in 2009, when you were coming with an idea for education based on technology deployment, you had a certain level of access to schools, and you could iterate even at different speeds with different groups, and nobody would understand exactly what was the forefront of the whole process. Today is a lot more difficult. There's more maturity in the system. Schools are not willing to let everybody in and test their product just for the sake of it. And I think it has a lot to do with how you bring an idea to market and how can you support your portfolio. Times are very different now from 2009.
And to his point, it also depends if you are a self-serve model, meaning that the teachers are the ones that are actually using the product first, or if you're selling into schools. So it's a quite complex question if you think about it. So approach us afterwards.
So I'd be curious. There's a question in here about future. Sorry, glasses are not doing what they should.
Do you believe the future? Is that the one you're doing?
No, it's smaller.
The smaller?
Yeah.
I'm going to try this without glasses. Future-ready kids need knowledge, skills, dispositions, and mindsets. Can we connect all of the learning environments in which kids learn, like out-of-school time and summer camp? Answer is some schools do that.
Yeah.
Some schools provide after-school time because they know their kids need it, or they partner with community organizations to engage the community. Many of the schools in our portfolio know that young people, they call it summer melt, and so they have summer programs so that young people are engaged and continuing to learn over the summer. So individual schools can do that, and schools can always partner with their community, and people who are preparing kids for college and high school have partnerships with colleges, and kids go to summer experiences in the post-secondary schools that they feel are a strong match. So it's a matter of deciding that your own program is more than what you do with kids between the regular school day and the 180 days of school that you provide.
So I think K through 12 is out of my depth, but the analogy I would draw is actually when I talk about providing greater agency to the learner and leveraging technologies and platforms to do that, this connecting these different learning experiences in different contexts outside of classroom or outside of traditional college and university is a critical part of that. So I think Lumina has some focused investment like the Credential investment that looks at how to do that. It also leverages what's emergent research around things like badging, where the better research on badging talks about how it motivates and it encourages young people to be able to both understand the skills that they're requiring in the context of an experience or curricular track that they're engaged in a way that encourages their continual participation and persistence. And so I think as we start to establish the mediums under which that expression can occur, we'll start to see more uptake and utilization by different types of providers in different contexts. So for me, whether it's employers or whether it's your internship program or whether it's something even more unstructured in terms of learning, or in the K through 12 example of the summer camp or outside of the classroom work, there's a medium for that integration to occur. So this is an interesting one, and I think gotten a lot of focus on. What do folks consider to be kind of fair outcomes? So I think fair outcomes was one of the principles that we have at Lumina that I mentioned, and I think it is sort of what I stated earlier, which is that there aren't gaps in the outcomes that we're seeing across lines of race or ethnicity or income or age, that when we talk about opportunity for all, we mean with an eye towards what that outcome is, not just providing broad access to experiences, but being able to ensure the successful end to that opportunity. And the next one is
We
due.
have 35 seconds.
30 seconds left.
Yeah.
Actually,
We're running out of time.
yeah, so if you were one of the ones that had some of the pressing remaining questions, I think folks will be available afterwards to respond to that. I wanted to close out the panel by asking us to reflect on, each of the panelists to reflect on kind of, as you look to the future, what are you most hopeful and encouraged by? And as you similarly, on the flip side of the coin, what worries you and keeps you up at night? Does anyone want to take that first?
I would like to see everybody having access to education, which is still not a reality worldwide. Starting from that is a big thing.
I want us to make more progress over the next 50 years than we made in the last 50 for all children.
I'm most excited about a program called SMASH, which is at one of the Kapor entities focusing on low-income kids of color and putting them through intensive summer programs around computer science, data science, electrical engineering, design thinking. So with a social justice lens, so having folks that have that perspective from those demographics that are the new majority and having them go out into the workforce is what gets me excited, because I see them as the new leaders and building companies that are going to change the world.
So I'm most hopeful and excited by the fact that there's continuing to be more alignment between these objectives across industry, across investment community, across philanthropy, and across education and social justice organizations. And I'm very hopeful that that kind of cross-sector dialogue is going to be a part of what builds the right set of actors and collaborators to realize and be responsive to the changing conditions that we're seeing in the future. Well, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. I know some of us will be available after the panel for folks who want to continue the conversation and find additional time to follow up. Thank you again.
Yeah.